Kevin Quaistra. Here, hold on. I'm starting to forget when I have my mask on. I'm the Executive Director of the Western Heritage Center. I want to welcome you to a beautiful, is it fall already now? Did we do that switch so suddenly in Montana? So, of course, we have lots of programs coming up. Go to our Facebook page, our website. We do an announcement. September 16, Mary Jane Bradbury was coming down to do a program. She's out of Helena. That program now is a live stream only. All the Humanities Montana projects and programs are now just available online. So tune in on September 16th for that program. I want to welcome our members. I'll give eyeballs on everybody. I know there's one out there, so we appreciate your support here at the Western Heritage Center. Our walking tours will continue through September, and then in October we have a couple special programs coming up on October 23rd and the 30th, which we're still planning on moving ahead. It's an outdoor event. We'll have actors portraying Billings' finest citizens who now reside at Mountain View Cemetery. So it's not going to be a spooky thing. Nothing's coming out of the ground. It's a daylight event, 10 o'clock in the morning through 1 o'clock on October 23rd and 30th, working in cooperation with the city of Billings, which has gracefully allowed us to tromp through their cemetery grounds. So we're very excited about this program today. I don't know when Jerry and I spoke maybe just a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm ready to do a tour of the Northern Great Plains. And of course, we're always like, I think we can fit you in somewhere, you know. And I know that Michelle just read his book. She's somewhere over there, and she said it was outstanding, so we'll use local. And then I have a couple quotes from people reviewing his book. Jim Bridger's story is as big as the West. This is a remarkable book about a remarkable man. Another reviewer said, an exciting, significant story. This is a lasting biography at its best. And I do think it's interesting. We've had several of these great books come out recently. The Yellowstone Kelly book, the wonderful book about Calamity Jane, and all of these researchers seem to have the same kind of pattern, an obsession for about a decade, where they do the research and they do the writing. I bet this has been a 10-year process for you at least, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Absolutely.
So anyway, I love that we have each of those books now available. So anyway, I'm pleased to have the author of the new Jim Bridger book, Jerry Enzler, with us today. It was published this year by Oklahoma Press, and it's full of great new information about Jim Bridger, one of America's greatest frontiersmen. Mr. Enzler is the founder and now president emeritus of the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium, a 14-acre Smithsonian-affiliated museum in
Dubuque. A French-Canadian fur trapper.
I wanted to say Des Moines, but that's not right. Dubuque, Iowa. Mr. Enzler is an award-winning writer and speaker. The museum exhibits and films that he and his staff have created have been viewed by over 4 million people. He arrives here in Montana and Wyoming for his road trip from Iowa. So we're pleased to have Jerry here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you so much for coming. I'm going to just put this right under here. It's a delight for me to be here because I've had so much fun as well as hard work in putting the research together, which I'm somewhat embarrassed to say that it's been over 40 years that I've been researching this. What really got me involved with this prospect is seeing the movie Jeremiah Johnson and going to the library and finding out that there's not a Jeremiah Johnson, there's a liver-eating Johnson, or Johnston. But I kept finding things about Jim Bridger, and he did not have nearly the acclaim that Daniel Boone or Kit Carson had, and I thought, well, why not? I looked at some of the biographies that have been written, and I found them just not up to date. They were 1946 and 1962, and that's a half century ago. And so I decided that I would write a book. I was looking for a job because I've been a volunteer teacher down in the state of Mississippi. And I thought I could finish the manuscript while I was taking care of our 2 children at home. Well, that did not go very well. That is a full-time job and then some. So I got a job with the Historical Society in Dubuque, and they were on the beginnings of founding a new museum, and so I was the founding director, the first employee. And it was so exciting that I was balancing the building of this new museum over the past 40 years and conducting my research on Jim Bridger. But I'm really pleased to know that it is off of my plate and into your hands as a book now, instead of a bunch of scattered notes. So I'm very excited to be here, and thank you for coming. It seemed to be all about the beaver trade. When Lewis and Clark returned in 1806 from their journey 1804 to 1806, that expedition, Meriwether Lewis mentioned the enormous quantity of beaver that could be captured in this western area. And that was significant not only for the economic value, but also for the national interests, because west of the Continental Divide, the northern part like Washington and Idaho and Oregon, that was in joint occupancy between Great Britain and the United States. And in 1828, they would decide who would actually claim that territory or how they were going to divide it. So I'm going to show you in a moment on one ad that was put in the paper, but I don't want to go to that just yet, of 1822. But I want to give you a little bit of foreground on Jim Bridger. He was born in 1804 in Richmond, and he traveled to the American Bottom, which is on the American side of the Mississippi River, what's now known as East St. Louis. They landed at a place called 6 Mile Prairie, 6 miles from the river. And this was Bridger's home when he was 8 years old. The War of 1812 was underway. And for the next 3 years, he was fearful, and his family was fearful, and everyone was fearful of the Potawatomis, as well as other indigenous peoples who were on the side of the British. And so while the British soldiers did battle with American soldiers, indigenous peoples who felt cheated out of their land over the past several decades, they took it upon themselves to have several raids, so that even the governor of Illinois Territory sent his children back to Kentucky for their safety. People like Jim Bridger at 8, and his brother and his sister and his parents, they were not able to go back. And so there was safe houses built about every 10 miles or so, and that's where people would gather in case of a raid. So that's what's going through the mind of Jim Bridger when he's 8 and 9 and 10 during the War of 1812. When Bridger was 12 years old, he was orphaned. His mother died when he was 12. His father died when he was 13. And in 1812, Bridger first worked on a keelboat, on a flatboat ferry, we presume going across the Mississippi River. At 12, obviously he wasn't the owner, but he was an assistant, and he got to learn the ways of the river. And that is a skill that he continued to have throughout his entire life, and he was making bull boats for people, or directing how to make a bull boat, all the way up to the time he was in his mid-60s. But he apprenticed, and this is where the earlier biographies are flawed, simply because there hadn't been enough research done. Bridger did not apprentice to a blacksmith in St. Louis. He apprenticed to one of the most celebrated gunsmiths who lived in Illinois, near Cahokia. His name was Philip Creamer. And Philip Creamer he actually learned his skill at Harper's Ferry. He made rifles for the Midwest during the War of 1812. And his rifles now are very, very strong, highly prized, and Bridger had the advantage of working under him. Significant to that is the Indian Agency hired Philip Creamer, and therefore his apprentice Jim Bridger, to go to the Illinois Indian Agency. It's never been noted before where that Illinois Indian Agency was. And it says in this book, that uncovered that it was in Peoria, which is an Indian term, a Native American term. It's on the Illinois River. It's in Illinois, of course. And so Bridger was living among or adjacent to the Potawatomis, the same group of people who had been having several raids, and that Bridger and his family were entirely scared of being annihilated by them during the War of 1812. And now he was helping them fix their guns or get hunting supplies. They were in very destitute shape now, the Potawatomis. And so for this 6-month period, Bridger was an apprentice, and it was such an isolated post that the actual Indian agent, Richard Graham, said, he told his brother, who was acting Secretary of Indian Affairs, George Graham, I'm not going to live out here unless I can build a new house. And George Graham, his brother, said, you cannot build a new house. So he went back to St. Louis, leaving Philip Creamer in charge and Bridger to do whatever he needed to do as an apprentice at the age of 12 and 13. A little bit later, and I will refer to that a little bit later too, Bridger saw, and let me see, I'm going to advance by doing that. And did it work? Am I pointing to the screen or? Okay. And we're frozen, probably with the same kind of fear that Jim Bridger had when he was living with the Potawatomis. Oh yeah, there's movement, okay. And that's the same image. Okay, so in 1822, this advertisement appeared. This one happened to be in February, and it talks about the need for enterprising young men who will ascend the River Missouri and stay there for 1, 2, or 3 years. That was the goal, and Lewis and Clark had said there's enormous wealth in these lands west of the Mississippi and up the Missouri, but the War of 1812 intervened, and now, and also there was a factor system, so the U.S. government handled all the trading. That was abolished in 1820, and so now 1822, this is a grand opportunity, 1, for people to make money, 2, for the nation to start to populate the far northwest. What did it mean for Bridger? Well, some trappers probably saw themselves, I'm reading from the book now, some trappers saw themselves building their fortunes on beaver pelts. Wives and sisters saw their men disappearing to a land of Indians and grizzlies, perhaps never to return. Did Bridger sign up for such an adventure to escape the expectations or the exclusions of civilization? He couldn't either read nor write. Was it to make his fortune, or was it to take the measure of the new land and make it his own? So that's a sense of what some of the narrative is about and how it's phrased. Do I point at the screen? I do point at the screen. Okay, so this is an image from a painting from Alfred Jacob Miller, who came west in 1837, but his drawings are so good. Bodmer and Catlin, they mainly stayed along the edges of the Missouri River. Alfred Jacob Miller went inland, and he went to the 1837 rendezvous, and he painted probably well over 100 first sketches and then paintings that would depict the life of the native peoples, the trappers who actually lived the lifestyle of the native peoples, and then also the tourists like William Drummond Stewart, who came out first in 1833, and the painters like Bodmer and Catlin and himself, and the writers who came out. They're all trying to capture the story of what's going on in this previously unknown area. Washington Irving described these people, Bridger and his comrades. A totally different new class has now sprung up, the mountaineers, the traders and trappers that scale the vast mountain chains and move from place to place on horseback, heedless of hardship, daring of danger, prodigal of the present, and thoughtless of the future. There is, perhaps, no class of men on the face of the earth who lead a life of more continued exertion, peril, and excitement. And from my research, I know that that is so. So they went from St. Louis up the Missouri River. They had incidents with the Arikara in 1823. The Assiniboines stole their horses in 1822. The Fort Henry was established in 1822. He moved it to 1823. The Hugh Glass incident happened we're over here in South Dakota. they decided that this was now the bloody Missouri. And so that instead they would start going overland. And so by going overland, this is down near the Kansas City area, they would follow the Platte mainly, and they would get to South Pass by 1824. So it was a whole different idea now. Instead of going up the Missouri and just trading there, they started going inland. Alfred Jacob Miller also went inland. And this is what Washington Irving was eloquently and perhaps exaggeratingly talking about Captain Bonneville and people like Jim Bridger, who he mentions in his book. This is a bull boat, and this, you see, there's both Euro-Americans, and those Euro-Americans are born in Kentucky and Virginia and other states. They're from Ireland, they're from Germany, they're French Canadians, they're Mexicans. They're a whole broad range of nationalities and ethnic groups among the Euro-Americans, as well as the native peoples who were all, not all, but mostly distinct from themselves. The Shoshone were different than the Crows, were different than the Flatheads, were different than the Nez Perce, were different than the Blackfeet. And so it was a huge gathering of various cultures and a free-roaming concept. And when they needed to cross something, they would quickly make a boat. They didn't have lumber, so they had buffalo hides. They were untanned, and they wrapped them around willow branches, and that was enough to get across and to make several of these. This is a little bit more of the life that Washington Irving was describing. This happens to be hunting elk. There's an incident way later in Bridger's life when he was guiding Captain Reynolds, and Reynolds said that there's a huge elk that he saw across the river. Well, the night before, the camp that Bridger had picked out for Reynolds, Indians had come into that camp and stolen some horses. That didn't mean anything to Jim Bridger. He said, well, I'm going out to hunt that elk. And he went out alone with his rifle, and he shot the elk, came back and said, you better send a wagon and at least 4 men. And they brought back over 1,000 pounds of that one elk, and they left the head and the legs and basically everything else. So it was a huge elk. And so hunting and living off the game was a very important part of the process. Getting lost was also an important part of the process. This is also an image by Alfred Jacob Miller called The Lost Trapper. And so these are the kind of experiences that Bridger would have experienced, as well as people like Jedediah Smith and so many more. The first company was Andrew Henry and William Ashley. And it evolved into Smith, Jackson, and Sublett. That's Jedediah Smith, William Sublett, the oldest of 5 Subletts who are out here in the West, and Davy Jackson, that Jackson Hole is named after. So that was the next 3. And by the time the company grew to that, 1825, 1826 to 1829, 1830, Bridger, by that point, had become pilot. How did he become a pilot for this Smith, Jackson, and Sublett group? Well, at the age of, I told you what he was doing when he was 12, and when he was 17, he signed up and went up the river when he was 18. By the time he was 20, he was the one who discovered among the Euro-Americans that the Great Salt Lake had salt in it. There was a lot of arguing and perspective about the Bear River. And the Bear River is down near Fort Bridger, and first it flows north. And then it flows to the west. And then it turns and starts to flow south. And so they all started arguing about where does it go? So a lot of bets were placed by this group of maybe 50, 60 men under John Weaver. And Bridger was either chosen or volunteered. He went down solo by horse following the Bear River, and he went through the Bear Canyon, which was somewhat intimidating. And he went through the canyon, and he got to where the Bear River flowed into this lake, and he tasted the water and found it was extraordinarily salty, and brought that information back. And William Ashley and many others were really excited to hear that, because salt was a wonderful commodity for preserving meats. He did that when he was 20 years old. When he was 21 years old, the 1825 rendezvous, the very first of 16 rendezvous, and it was held near Henry's Fork, close to where Fort Bridger is today. Ashley, and they've been hunting for 2 years and accumulating, turned out to be $50,000 worth of beaver fur. And it had to be taken back to St. Louis. And so Ashley was going to meet a keelboat that was way up at the junction of the Yellowstone and the Missouri River. And they got to what's called Bad Pass. And Bad Pass is on the lower canyon of the Bighorn River. And it is a walking or riding path. But far down below that treacherous path was an extraordinarily turbulent rapids, also called the Bad Pass Rapids. Ashley said, I need somebody to go through those rapids and tell me, should we carry our $50,000 worth of cargo on homemade rafts or bull boats? Bridger volunteered, or Bridger was appointed. However he got there, he was the very first known person. There's no record, but I'm sure maybe Native Americans had done it, but he was the first known person to go through the Bad Pass Rapids at the age of 21. At the age of 22, he was now then in a brigade being led by William Sublette, and they went into what's now the boundaries of Yellowstone. Now, John Coulter was one of the first Euro-Americans to experience the thermal wonders, but those were kind of close to Cody, and Audrey Haynes in his book makes a distinction between who were the first Euro-Americans who actually saw what is present-day Yellowstone boundaries. And it was William Sublette, and Jim Bridger was part of that group, and he was 22. Now, I don't know what you had done by the time you were 22, but I know I hadn't done anything near what Bridger had done, discovering Great Salt Lake and being the first known person to go through the Bad Pass Rapids and being part of a group that goes into Yellowstone and sees all those enormously satisfying, or curiously, the thermal wonders and all the wonders of Yellowstone. Bridger became a godfather, if you will, of Yellowstone, and the idea that eventually that it would become he didn't think it should become a national park. He just thought people should know about it. And he told people about it, and they said, oh, those are Jim Bridger's damn lies. You can't believe that. That's impossible. And he told several historians and several map makers, and they wrote it in their journals. And they said, we believe it. We believe it's true. Reynolds said, but there's thermal areas like that, I think in Iceland, he said. But the Kansas City newspaper editor wrote a long article in the 1850s about the wonders of Yellowstone that he heard from Jim Bridger. The people at the paper said, don't publish that. You'll be laughed at. Those are old Jim Bridger's lies. Advance another 15 years, and suddenly Yellowstone National Park was created, the first national park in the world. And this editor printed a public apology and wrote what he had originally put down in 1856 and didn't send it out, and apologized to Bridger and his family for doubting him. But Bridger, one of the best stories, or most of the stories that Bridger told, were often about Yellowstone. But back to this area here. Oh, this is called Indian hospitality. So you've got American, German, French, whatever nationality. You have a woman with a baby, a papoose. You've got a man, woman there. They're in a Shoshone lodge. Again, this is Alfred Jacob Miller's image. And this was important. So was this. This is a campfire, which would happen almost every night. They had to cook their meat, and then it was usually story time. And there's a long heritage of people telling stories. Moses Black Harris was a great storyteller. Jim Bridger was one of the best. And they would, get up in front of the others for accent or for drama and tell the exciting things that they did, or they wish they did, or they made up stories. And that's the part of it. They're called tall tales for a reason. They're pretty tall. Now, this is a man called Eagle Ribs. In the past, all we know is that, I'll back up a little bit, in 1833, well, I was saying he was pilot for Smith, Jackson, and Sublette. In 1830, Bridger became one of the 5 partners for the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Company. And the Rocky Mountain Fur Company consisted of Tom Fitzpatrick as the lead, And Jim Bridger is the second lead, because he couldn't read or write like Fitzpatrick, but he knew the land better than anyone by this point. And after all, he was 26 years old. He's probably an old man, and they started calling him Old Gabe at 26. Milton Sublett, the brother of William, and Henry Frapp, which is actually spelled Frabe, and Gervais, a French-Canadian. So those five owned the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Company, and they were opposed by the American Fur Company, which is now under the guidance of Pierre Chateau and the Chateau family from St. Louis. It had been founded by John Jacob Astor, who was the wealthiest man in the world. And in around 1826, he conveyed his Western fur trade activity to the Chateau family from St. Louis. So the American fur companies, they're amateurs, they're new, let's say. They don't know where the beaver furs are. They don't know where certain valleys that have been trapped out, and others where they haven't gone to for a while. So this was a wild goose chase. And I don't know who was the wild goose. It probably was Fitzpatrick and Bridger. Everywhere they went, the brigade from American Fur Company followed them and fouled up their hunt. It was so discouraging for Fitzpatrick and Bridger that they actually, at one point, they kept all their fires burning. They lit fires. They made it look like they were staying for the night. And then they snuck out, leaving all their fires lit. Well, that didn't work. American Fur caught them. Other times they tried to race away. That didn't work either. Finally, Bridger and Fitzpatrick said, we're just going to the Three Forks, where the Blackfeet are upset because they have an alliance with the British and their forts, and they don't really want to have Americans trapping in their land. But anyway, they went to the Three Forks, and on one of the forks, Vanderburg, I believe, was killed at that one. Andrew Drips was attacked on one of the second one, and on the Madison, I believe it was, Jim Bridger took 2 arrows in the back by Eagle Ribs and his men. And you can read more about it in the book. One arrowhead came out easily. The other one didn't come out for 3 years. And 3 years later, in 1835, you can read a very vivid description of how they pulled out one of those arrowheads, which the bone and cartilage had grown around it, and the curves of the prongs of the arrowhead had started to bend. So it took 2 men actually to stand on his back, give him a lot of whiskey first, stand on his, or put a foot on his back and try to pull those out with some kind of a pliers. And the arrowhead actually straightened as it came out and bent back into a normal shape. And we know this because it's been recorded by 2 people, including this man, William Drummond Stewart, who did all these paintings, or hired these paintings to be done in 1837. Here's how significant it was to William Drummond Stewart. He wrote a book in the 1850s, 20 years later, and he said, as I write this today, I have that arrowhead in my pocket in Merthley Castle in Perthshire, Scotland, because Jem, which is how the Scottish would say Jem was one of my best buddies in the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade era. So this was an exciting but a discouraging episode in Jim Bridger's life to take these 2 arrowheads. This is Fort, well, it originally started as Fort William in 1834. William Sublett built this in 1834 as a trading post. It was then purchased by Tom Fitzpatrick and Jim Bridger and 3 or 4 more, Fontenelle, Drips, and I think there might have been 1 more in that partnership. So first was Fort William. It became known as Fort Laramie, though, because it was on the Laramie River. And Bridger owned it for about a year, and then they sold it. And then eventually went to, it was turned into a military fort, I believe it was 1848, 49. But an interesting part of our history, and here's another view from the interior. Again, this is how it looked, or how Alfred Jacob Miller, the artist, thought it might look, or thought it should look. But I think it's relatively accurate. You've got a lot of commotion and activity going here. It's a very safe place to be from attack. And so that's a significant part of his history. So at this, I'm going to talk about the rendezvous of 1837. This is the rendezvous at 1837, and there was a grand gathering, there was wine that had come from Scotland that Alfred Drummond Stewart had brought over. I'll explain it as David Brown, a trapper, later wrote. On the right of Captain Stewart sat, or rather squatted in Oriental fashion, one of the most remarkable men of this remarkable assemblage. This was Jim Bridger, the leader of the beaver hunting parties, with a thorough acquaintance with the whole mountain region from the Russian settlements in Californias, and then it goes on to exaggerate every nook and hidden lake, and I think that's a little bit more. But this is interesting, and this is in the book. The physical conformation of this man was in admirable keeping with his character. Tall, 6 feet at least, muscular, without an ounce of superfluous flesh to impede its force or exhaust its elasticity. He might have served as a model or a sculptor for a painter, by which to express the perfection of graceful strength and easy activity. Now, Kevin, that's your description, isn't it? It sounds just like you. But getting closer to Jim Bridger, his cheekbones were high, his nose hooked or aquiline, the expression of his eye mild and thoughtful, and that of his face was grave almost to solemnity. So I want to go a little bit more and describe a little bit about this caravan here and this painting. I'm going to go back. Alfred Jacob Miller wrote this: the whole plain is dotted with lodges. By the way, this is on Horse Creek, where Horse Creek meets Green River near Pinedale, Wyoming. It's dotted with lodges and tents with groups of Indians surrounding them. In the river near the foreground, Indians are bathing. To the left rises a bluff overlooking the plain, whereon are stationed some braves and Indian women. In the midst of them is Captain Bridger in a full suit of armor. That's incorrect, he exaggerated. It really was simply just I don't mean simply, but it was the helmet with the red plume and this cuirass, which is a breastplate and a backplate. This gentleman was a famous mountain man, and we venture to say that no one has traveled here within the last 30 years without seeing or hearing of them. Why the armor? William Stewart likened Bridger and his men as if they were King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Stewart purchased a unique gift for Bridger, ordering it from Britain, shipping it to St. Louis, and then carrying it carefully boxed to the rendezvous. So it was pretty significant. So I'm going to give you a close-up of this area right here. It's going to be a little bit blurry because I just had to zoom in on it. But here you can see the red plume and the helmet and the cuirass. And not only did Bridger ride around in this, but Joe Meek and several others did too. And it's interesting, there are references, some of the people who did, they were misquoting Shakespeare. And it's described in the book, the things they were saying, you know, my kingdom for a horse and those kind of things. So it's a very rich life. We're up to 1837. Bridger's 33 years old. He's been in the West since 1822, so he's been here 15 years. He definitely by now is the king of the mountain men. Some of the others who are very extraordinary figures also is Tom Fitzpatrick. And Tom Fitzpatrick, I'll tell you another story from 1824 when Bridger was 20 years old. The Bannock Indians stole horses from the brigade of trappers. Now, when you're on the frontier like this, you can't let your horses be stolen. One, you may not survive, and two, they may just continue to steal. So 2 people stepped forward and said, we're going to get these horses back. One of them was Jim Bridger, 20 years old, no, actually 21 years old, and Tom Fitzpatrick, 26 years old, who had been born in Northern Ireland and had come over as an adult. And so Fitzpatrick's role was to have his band of men shoot into the Bannock village to distract them. Bridger's role at 21 was to lead probably people who were much older than he was, to lead them to where the horses were kept and to get away with their horses and as many Bannock horses as they could as well. And so he started teaming up with Fitzpatrick that early. Going a little bit further, this is an imagined or an artistic rendition of Robert Campbell. And we have a later portrait of Robert Campbell, and the artist kind of went back in time and suggested this is how he might have looked at the time. Those three gentlemen, Fitzpatrick, Bridger, and Campbell, they were last seen all together in 1854. Bridger's fort had been taken from him by the Church of Latter-day Saints, and he and Vasquez were paid $9,000. They were kind of forced to sell, and the actual value of the livestock and all the goods that they confiscated was worth $7,600, or almost that. So the value of the fort itself, which was generating $10,000 or more of gross income, they sold that, or they only got compensation of about $1,400 something for that. But it was a take that or take nothing is what the sheriff of the Greene County precinct, which was now part of Utah Territory, told them. Bridger went out to Washington, D.C. to try and get his fort back. And he roamed the halls of Congress and talked to senators, and they almost changed the Kansas-Nebraska bill as it was moving forward, and lopping off the western Wyoming area and making that part of Utah, keeping it part of Nebraska territory instead of giving it to Utah. That infuriated Brigham Young so much, he wrote a more acceptable letter to the senators, saying that you really can't trust Jim Bridger. He's telling you a lot of tall tales, it's stories. Then he wrote to Bernheisel, his aide. This is Brigham Young writing. I'm going to use a little bit of French language here. And he said, Brigham Young writes to his personally, he said, now, you tell those members of Congress that if they think that Jim Bridger is the oracle of all things West, you tell them to kiss my ass, damn you. Then someone, either Bridger or Brigham Young or his clerk, drew a line through those words, those 5 words. And I really wanted to actually that to be a chapter title, but I bowed off on it. But I think if it ever got on David Letterman top 10 funny things that people say in the West, it would have gone in my top 10. But he went on to say to Bernheisel, and you can also tell them that if Jim Bridger were to come back to Utah and act under the laws the way he had been, he would find himself strung up between heaven and earth. So this is correspondence in 1854. In 1855, Bridger obviously knew he was not going to get ability to come back to his fort, he and Louis Vasquez, so he knew he had to sell, and he tried to get the best bargain he could. But that's what he was doing in Washington, D.C. On Christmas Day, Tom Fitzpatrick, who you saw a picture of, Jim Bridger, were at Robert Campbell's counting house in St. Louis. And that was the day that they left to go to Washington, D.C. Fitzpatrick was there because he had been he had orchestrated the Great Plains Indian Tribe Treaty of 1851, the largest assembly of indigenous peoples in North America that's known to history anyway, over 10,000. Father DeSmet said it was the greatest slaughter of the canine population ever in the world, because the Indians carried dogs with them or brought dogs along with them and then used them when they ran out of buffalo meat. There was more meat that they could have. They checked into a place called Brown's Hotel, which existed in Washington, D.C. all the way up into, I think, the 1940s. It was on Pennsylvania Avenue between the Capitol and the White House, very prominently situated. So Bridger and Fitzpatrick each have rooms there. Fitzpatrick goes to New York, comes back, and has pneumonia. He becomes deathly ill. Campbell is up in Philadelphia. He comes down, and so Bridger and Campbell are with Tom Fitzpatrick when he dies in his hotel room, the Brown's Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. And that's just a little bit of how their lives intersected. Here's another one, Kit Carson. And Kit Carson came from the southwest area to start trapping the Rocky Mountain, upper Rocky Mountain areas in 1830. But at the same time they heard that Jedediah Smith had been killed, they saw this young, scrappy, short but very determined man, Christopher Carson, known as Kit Carson, or as one of the map makers called him, Kid Carson. He was German and he insisted on calling him Kid Carson. So generally, Carson and Bridger agreed. But I'll give you an instance which shows a little bit of the character of Jim Bridger. Smallpox has devastated indigenous people populations throughout history in North America. There was a tremendous outbreak of smallpox among Indians in the 1830s. And Congress was not blind to this. Much like today, Congress appropriated, in this case, $12,000 to take smallpox vaccine and doctors up the Missouri River and inoculate as many Indian tribes and peoples as they could. Well, it just wasn't enough money. They didn't even get all the way to the Mandans, so the Mandans suffered terribly. So did the Blackfeet, which had been the longtime enemy of Bridger, Fitzpatrick, and all the rest. So Bridger is leading his troop, his brigade of men. He has many of them are hired and working under Bridger. Bridger's now working for the Chateau Company. And there's a whole other group of people called free trappers. And a free trapper traps whenever he wants, goes wherever he wants. If he wants some supplies, he buys them from Bridger and his company. But they all trap wherever they want. They fort wherever they want. They're part of the long gatherings. So they're following this group of Blackfoot. There's a village, women, children, and men. And Bridger and Carson, they start to see dead bodies laying aside. And these are Blackfeet who had suffered under smallpox and died. And so it was a horrific sight. Kit Carson, Joe Meek, another famous person from the West, and Osborne Russell, who wrote a great book about daily life, they and several others said, now is our chance. We're going to take our revenge against the Blackfeet. Bridger said, no, we're not. So there was a split of the two. And so while those free trappers went off to attack this Blackfeet village, Bridger said, I'm not going, and neither are any of my men. And all the ones who are under my charge are going to stay here and protect the equipment that we have, and we're not participating in this raid. So there are several Blackfeet that were killed, not too many women and children, but there were several men who were killed, and they boasted about it, Carson and Russell and Meek, at the 1838 rendezvous. And it was something, so that it shows a difference. I would say that Kit Carson was more reactive and maybe temperamental or responsive immediately. Bridger was perhaps more prudent, or maybe remembered his time among the Potawatomis when they were peaceful, and his time with the Crows and others. He would fight whenever he needed to fight to defend himself, but he didn't really take on attacks, where people like Carson would take on attacks of people like that, who they felt had misused them. So there's a little bit of a difference between two great American frontier heroes. This is an image of Fort Bridger. The first Fort Bridger was built in 1841, and it was on the Green River, and it was built by the partnership of Bridger and Frapp, Henry Frabe. Henry Frapp was killed in the summer of 1841, and Bridger said, it's probably time to move our fort further west, and also time to send our daughter, Mary Ann, up to the Whitman mission. So Marcus and Narcissa Whitman basically took care of Mary Ann for the rest of her life. So by this time, Bridger had married a Flathead woman. Her name was Cora, and he'd had 3 children. They had had 3 children together, and then she died. It's suggested maybe by being bitten by a mad or rabid wolf. So the second Fort Bridger was built close to where the current Fort Bridger is, but up high on a bench. In 1842, Bridger's new partner was Luis Vasquez. And in 1843, they went down to the flats right along the various streams of the Black's Fork. And that's where it basically was from 1843 to 1853 when Bridger sold it, 1857 when the Mormons burned it, and the military fort, continued at that point. And then the fort we see today is a reproduction of what it might have looked like. So this is a painting just to remind me to tell you a little bit of the history of Fort Bridger in the short time we have today. This is Washakie Shoshone. Many of you probably recognize the image. There were others early on in the 1820s and 30s that Bridger and Fitzpatrick and others had a strong relationship with. By the 1840s and definitely the 1850s, Washakie had risen to enormous prominence among the Shoshone people. And Washakie did not like the fact that the Church of Latter-day Saints, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, were actually building settlements and building farms. They liked better the idea that what the Euro-Americans were doing were taking people across the Green River by ferry boat, and Bridger had several of those, or by having a trading post like Fort Bridger. And Fort Bridger was originally built as a trading post with the Shoshone and other native tribes, and then it became very useful on the Oregon Trail. This is a map of a lot of the explorations, and you see all these lines. Well, some of them are rivers, but you see all of these, they indicate the different routes that Bridger actually was chief guide for. Stansbury in 1849, which would go from Fort Bridger to Salt Lake, and in 1850, which to go all the way across here through Bridger Pass. Bridger Pass had been known about since the 1820s, but this exact location of the Bridger Pass was one selected by Bridger, and it became the Overland Trail, and then the railroad location, and then more or less Interstate 80, you're darn close to it. So this is just a wealth. I'm not going to go into it, but the wealth of exploration. This is a whole new career for Bridger. He was a fur trader and an explorer. Then he was a fort owner on the Oregon Trail. And then he became a guide to map makers. G.K. Warren was also with Ferdinand Hayden. That name may not be known to you, but Ferdinand Hayden was one of the foremost scientists of the Smithsonian. And Warren and Hayden wanted to explore the Yellowstone River, which is here, and they wanted to go, it ends up here in the Missouri. They only got as far as the Powder River, but it was very fruitful for them, and the diaries of G.K. Warren and Ferdinand Hayden, which I was able to look at, are very illustrative of Bridger's value. And Bridger told he told all of these people about the wonders of Yellowstone. They all wrote about it. The country just didn't believe him. So it's interesting. If you tell too big a lie, it won't, well, he wasn't lying at all, but that's why he started telling the bigger lies. But it's very significant, and the book goes into many of these journeys with a lot of new information about each one. This happens to be a very small segment of a map. It's called the Bridger-Collins map, and it's in the Wyoming American Heritage Center. And I think a few years ago, it was voted as one of the top 10 artifacts in Wyoming history. And the issue here is to go from Fort Laramie here. They would normally go on the Laramie River and then Civil Creek, and then go back to the Laramie River and go to Fort Halleck, which right here, Fort Halleck. But on the way back, young Casper Collins describes the direct route that Bridger showed them. And this line is not on Collins' map. It is something that's probably added by one of the historians in the 1920s when they first received the map. But a very interesting thing, like there's one, I don't know if it still exists, there's something called Bedtick Creek. Maybe it's still there along the North Platte, I don't know. The inscription on the back says, "This map was drawn by Jim Bridger in the dirt with a stick." And then he redrew it onto an animal skin with charcoal. And then Collins took over and did a more exacting, or with a lot more detail. And Bridger at his side was, showing him how to do that. It's the only map that we know of that exists now today that Bridger had a significant part in creating. As I've been driving through the hills and valleys of this area, it's so easy to get lost. And how Bridger could make that direct line, and not just of this small area, but we're talking about vast amounts of terrain. He couldn't read or write, but if you asked him, he would start describing all the things. And then you come to the medicine bow, and then you come here, but be careful here because that's a poison spring. Now you're going to be dry here, but if you dig enough in the sand, the water will pool up. And this is how he saved people's lives, just by telling them this. So he was a remarkable character in American history and a fascinating person and a fascinating personality. We're now in the 1860s, which is good because it's 1252. This is the hanging of the chiefs, and it's a drawing taken from life, I mean from the actual amount. This is in the Beinecke Library in Yale, and I went out and saw this and asked permission to put it in. General Connor ordered the hanging of 2 of these Indian chiefs or Indians who had mistreated white hostages. And he said, and leave their bodies hanging there. And one of them, before he was hanged, he leaped off and tried to hang himself, and rather than be hanged by the whites, he wanted to hang himself that way. Another one tried to escape, and he climbed up the rope, and he was on the gallows up the top, or the bar up at the top, and they were saying, shoot him, and they said, no, the order was to hang them. So one of the soldiers climbed up the scaffolding there and had a fight with him and pushed him down, and he was hanged as well. And then the orders were to leave the bodies there, and they did, with weights on their ankles, and eventually their limbs fell off, and still they were left there. And then Moonlight had another person, and he had them hanged also. And Bridger said this is going to be extraordinarily difficult for the Indians to live with, and it's going to be very dangerous for all of us here at this fort, at Fort Laramie. This is the 1860s period. You're probably familiar with a lot of this area. We have Bridger's Ferry, and I've learned and wrote in the book that this was not just an entrepreneurial, just himself. He was actually working with the U.S. Army to build that ferry, and similar to an arrangement that others he knew had done in St. Louis. They gave him all the material, the ropes, the wood, the soldiers to help build it. And the idea was that whenever the soldiers needed to cross this, and they had a difficult time, Connor in 1865 had a real difficult time crossing the North Platte. And so that's why in 1866, General Grenville Dodge at Fort Atkinson called Bridger up to come with him, called him to come to Fort Atkinson. And I think that's when they made the deal, because by April, you're seeing telegrams. And by this time, the Army's using telegrams, and that's what I'm looking at the National Archives. Small sheets of paper about this size, handwritten, and you just page through them and you see them. It's much easier than scanning some of the long handwritten letters. It's more precise. And so he's sending telegrams saying, give Bridger whatever he wants. Send soldiers to help him. No, he's not going to have to pay for this. We're taking material from some of the other forts that have been abandoned or other locations, and this is something. And so it was run by a man named Ben Mills, who was married to a Lakota, and they had mixed blood children. But Bridger was the owner of it and the beneficiary as well. But then, so there was the Connor expedition, and that was in 3 parts. Bridger was the only worthwhile scout or guide. The ones with Cole and Walker were atrociously bad, and you'll read about that in the book. The things that they said about the horrible work of the guides on the other 2 expeditions. And then you come to the 1866, and you have the building of the changing of Fort Connor to Fort Reno, the building of Fort Phil Kearny, the building of Fort C.F. Smith. And Bridger went from Fort Phil Kearny up to C.F. Smith with Jim Beckworth. Beckworth died shortly after. Bridger was up here during the Battle of the Hundred in the Hand, which we sometimes call the Fetterman fight. And right after the Lakota and Sioux and Cheyenne basically killed Fetterman and his other soldiers and leaders, they wanted to go attack Fort C.F. Smith. And the Crow resisted. The Crow, this is a quote, from the commanding officer at Fort C.F. Smith, and it's one of the chapter titles. The Crow would not allow Bridger to be hurt. And therefore, so their love for Bridger, who they first met in 1824, here it is 1866, and they have this strong respect, and for that reason alone, Fort C.F. Smith was saved, and many of the men there, including Bridger, were saved from a huge onslaught, because by that time it was not only Lakota and Cheyenne and Arapaho, but it was about 8 other Indian nations were all gathering together to wipe out the Indians. Bridger said the route, whoops, let me go back. That's Red Cloud, and he was leading a lot of the opposition. Just a couple more here. So Bridger said the route to take is, it became known as the Bridger Trail. This goes on the west side of the Bighorn Mountains. There's a lot of wood, there's a lot of pasture, but it was dry, but it was safe. Bridger been through this a long time. Bozeman decided to say, well, I'm going to lead people right through the Lakota territory, and that led to hundreds of deaths, millions of dollars of expense. And I just read a sign, well, I don't know where it is now. It was on my way near the town of Bridger, where the Bridger Trail went. Right on Clark's Fork is where it was. And the sign, I posted this morning on my Facebook page, Jerry Enzler, author, and it said a woefully poor or inadequate route, talking about the Bridger Trail. And it ends by saying an estimated 450 people took the Bridger Trail in 1864, and far more took the Bozeman Trail. And that is not true. You'll read in my book that 2,500 people in 1864 took the Bridger Trail through the Crow country, and the Crow said, where's our friend Bridger? We want to see him. They went on the Bozeman Trail, and Red Cloud himself said, you need to go on Big Throat's path. Big Throat's or the Blanket Chief's path. I think it was the Blanket Chief's path, which was the Crow name for Bridger. So 2,500 went on the Bridger Trail, 1,500 men, women, and children went on the Bozeman Trail. 1865 and 6, the U.S. Army said, we're going through on the Bozeman Trail. Hundreds of lives lost, millions of money spent. And I'll just close with a statement from the book. One soldier summarized it succinctly. Quote, James Bridger was with us all the summer of 1866, up until late in the fall. If Colonel Carrington and the officers had followed the advice of Bridger, I do not think there would have been nearly as many of our men killed. And parenthetically, native peoples as well. Continuing, Bridger, told the officers not to follow the Indians and to send more men on escort duty, but they thought he was old and did not know anything about Indian warfare. Bridger left the West in 1868. He bought property in Kansas City, Westport area, as early as 1853. He was living more or less permanently by 1868. He died in 1881. He became blind in about 1875 or so. And it's just a wonderful story throughout. He's a man of great integrity. He likes to talk and tell stories. It's either Kevin or I does that. I don't know. Maybe it's me. I don't know. And he also was a tremendous asset and resource to this nation. And so when they were planning who should be on, it wasn't going to be Mount Rushmore. It was going to be a place called the Needles in South Dakota. Who should be honored? Well, there were 5 or 6 or 8 that were proposed, and one of them was Jim Bridger. And then the artist came in, the sculptor, and he said, no, we're not doing those Western characters. We're going to do 4 presidents, and that's what happened, which is fine, but it just shows how important Bridger was to the nation in 1920s, that he would be one of the 8 people who would be enshrined at what we now call Mount Rushmore. So thank you for listening, and I know we have time for questions if you have any questions. Oh, I better show you the last 2 pictures. This is Red Cloud. This is a drawing by William Henry Jackson of Jim Bridger, and when you normally see this photograph, you won't see the pants, or pantaloons as they called it in the 1930s. Whoops. Well, let's see, we can go down. Anyway, you don't need to see it, but they're corduroy type. I don't know if that's the term for it, but you can tell that this is an artistic rendition. It's at the Smithsonian. I found out by my research at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I saw this image in a photograph, and the person who was writing it had been with Bridger when they were exploring the Yellowstone River with G.K. Warren and Ferdinand Hayden. His name was Jimmy Stevenson, and it was 1886. And he said, I came into the castle, that's the castle at the Smithsonian, to send this letter back to you and answer your questions about Jim Bridger. And I also enclose my photograph, which is now at the Smithsonian, my photograph of Jim Bridger, which is basically this one. So I called the Smithsonian and said, you know, you have the original. And they said, no, the only thing we have is one that we have identified as Kit Carson. And I said, well, it's not Kit Carson, it's Jim Bridger. They haven't fully changed the documentation yet, but I will make them change it eventually. Anyway, so questions, please.
Is that the only picture you have of Jim Bridger?
No, we have another one right here, right on the cover. So this one was taken, I think, 1857. In 1857 it was taken, probably in Kansas City. This one might have been taken in Virginia City because I think it was 1866. And Bridger was there in 65 and 66. Could have been somewhere else, but I'm not sure if it's dated 1866 or 67. Those are the only two known images other than the Alfred Jacob Miller, where you really can't tell exactly what he looks like. And you notice all the wrinkles on the cover here under his neck. Bridger's name was Cassipee to the Flatheads, and Cassipee meant blanket chief. To his friends, he was known as Old Gabe. To the Lakota, he was known as Big Throat. And Big Throat was because he had goiter, and he had a thyroid deficiency, and so he had a large neck. Long answer to a short question. Yes?
In all of your studies, did you ever come across somebody by the name of Johnny Healy? How did he play into all this?
How do you spell the last name?
Healey.
It's vaguely familiar, but it doesn't stand up real strong. Do you have a connection?
Sorry?
Do you have a connection? I mean, do you have an idea of what it might be, how he might have been related to him?
He was operative in the fur trade between the Canadians and Montana, and was involved in that quite a bit. I was just wondering if there was
Okay.
information.
Yeah. I might have recognized that, but I don't know for sure. Yes?
I mean, Bridger and Bozeman, did they have a race across the two trails and both ended up at Virginia City at the same time?
More or less true, except it wasn't a race. And Bridger left early. Bozeman caught up. Actually, they all gathered on the Yellowstone River, and from then it was kind of, everybody knew the way then and they were out of dangerous territory, so they all kind of separated, whether they're Bozeman or Bridger. It didn't really matter who they were with. So it wasn't really a race initially, and a historian named Burlingame, I think his name is, he's the one who debunked the fact that it was a race. But people did note that. You know, Bridger was basically, you know, forging a new trail and had to make, it wasn't like he on his horse, it was people with wagons, so they had to do diggings to get, you know, through the creeks. Mark? Oh, yes, right there.
Bridger would have got like Bitcoin at the time. What would have been the coin around for him when he received these like $50,000, $1,000, which would be carried gold bars?
Well, he was carrying gold coins. The $4,000, some of it that was paid in two segments for the fort. Some of that was in gold coins, and that's recorded in the book. Bridger found gold in 1833, and that's the one rendezvous he didn't go because he stayed there on the Chugwater River south of Fort Laramie to try to exploit that, but never found it. And did it again when Stansbury and his group were waiting or camping around there. And there's also other areas with Reynolds where there are 3 times that he found gold and knew where there was gold. And Reynolds said, do not tell our men because they're perfectly suited to be miners. We've got explosives here. We've got shovels. we've got very strong men, and they'll all desert. So he commanded Bridger not to tell anybody 3 locations where he knew there was gold. One more.
Did they really devastate the beaver in the 1820s and 30s?
Well, one of the first that tried to devastate it was the Hudson Bay Company, and they were trying to make a like you could burn a forest before the fire comes. Well, they were wiping out the beaver before the Americans came, and basically once they got into a region probably close to here, they wanted it all trapped out so the Americans wouldn't continue west. So they called it, the British called it, we're going to make a beaver desert. We're going to annihilate them entirely. And so they didn't totally wipe them out, neither Hudson Bay nor the Americans in later years.
It appears that even today, the beaver formed a lot of our drainages.
Yes, right. Yeah, they do.
And even today, they're suffering because they're gone.
Yeah, but no, they didn't try to do it. They tried to make as much money as they could. It was the Hudson Bay Company that tried to wipe out a whole area so that the Americans wouldn't continue going west. A question or a comment? Comment to say we're done?
Question. I was surprised, the book does a really good job about showing the vehemence of Brigham Young towards Jim Bridger. Was he that way, was Young that way all the time, or was that just his attitude towards Bridger?
No, he was that way pretty much everybody. He said, this was during the time where Bridger sold, it was called the era of blood atonement. And he would preach from the pulpit. And by the way, he said, I know it can be pretty profane, but I only swear when I'm from the pulpit. He said, well, that's not true. But he said, so he preached to his Mormon congregation, if you know that your neighbor is disregarding the rules of the church, you would be doing him a service if you would slit his throat. Because by the slitting of his blood, he will now enter heaven. So that's the kind of rhetoric that he used a lot. I hate to say it, but he's a little bit like Donald Trump in terms of saying things to really get your attention. Regardless of where you stand, there's no question that Trump really knew how to get attention, and so did Brigham Young.
All right, I want to thank Jerry again for coming. It was a wonderful presentation. We actually, I think the Western Heritage Center has 3 copies of the book. And Jerry drives around the Northern Plains with cases of his book. So he sold 11 last night. We've sold 5 so far, I think.
6 this morning.
Oh, 6. So we need 5 more to match Red Lodge, okay? So, and I did want to acknowledge also Mike Penfold and Our Montana for their support for this program, too. We really appreciate it. So anyway, have a great day. Thank you.